Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to PCABV's Training Institute. My name is Rachel Haynes-Pinsker, and I am the Legal Services Manager for the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our webinar, Human Trafficking and Domestic Violence, a Legal Perspective. So I just want to go over a few housekeeping matters before we get going. So you can download the materials if you haven't done so yet, and it's located in the Files area. You can use the chat area to type any questions to the presenter or if you have technical issues. We will mute all users on our end, so please type your questions into the chat box because we hopefully will not be hearing from you. So if you need to mute, you can hit *6 to mute your phone. So again, please make sure you're muted. We also will be recording this webinar. So I now want to introduce our presenter, and we are very lucky to have here with us this afternoon Shea Rhodes. And Shea has dedicated her career to combating violence against women, protecting the rights of those who are oppressed or exploited, and championing human rights. She's a statewide legal expert on Pennsylvania laws related to sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. As the co-founder and director of the Institute to Address Commercial Sexual Exploitation, known as the CSE Institute at Villanova University School of Law, Shea works with and on behalf of victims and survivors of commercial sexual exploitation and human trafficking. She also operates her own private law practice, providing representation to victims and survivors in both civil and criminal matters. Prior to forming the CSE Institute in 2014, Ms. Shea served the Philadelphia community as an assistant district attorney for nearly 10 years. During that time, she was on the team that founded Project Dawn Court, a criminal justice diversion program for women who have multiple convictions for the crime of prostitution. And she continues to sit on the oversight committee for Project Dawn Court. And before joining the DA's office, Shea served as a staff attorney for the Crime Victims Law Project, where she provided legal assistance and advocacy to adult and child victims of rape, sexual assault, and stalking. Shea regularly conducts trainings and presentations throughout Pennsylvania and regionally. Most recently, her work was published in Penn Live Online and the Delaware Lawyer magazine. Most recently, and other written works, including policy papers and newsletters, can be found on the CSE Institute website. She graduated from Villanova Law School and the University of Kansas. So without further ado, Shea, I am going to turn the webinar over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. You guys, I'm so excited to be here, and I really thank you so very much to PCABV for this incredible opportunity. I see a lot of you who have signed up and have called in that I've had conversations with or trained in person, so I'm just thrilled to be here with all of you guys today. We have a lot of slides to cover, and so forgive me for speaking too fast. I don't want to miss anything, but at the end of this presentation, I hope that all of you will be better able to understand both the federal and state laws on trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, identify the intersection between domestic violence and sex trafficking, and understand why victims of sex trafficking don't always self-identify as victims, and that the psychological and trauma bonds with their trafficker are probably the biggest obstacle in their recovery. So I just wanted to give you guys quickly a basic definition and put these up here side by side, domestic violence and sex trafficking. So according to the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women, domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner. And you can see here that sex trafficking, according to the United Nations Palermo Protocol, is at a minimum the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability in order to induce an individual into involuntary servitude. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of what both the federal and state law are, I want to introduce all of you to two survivors, GLORIA and Tara. And first I'm going to talk about GLORIA, and I just want you guys to keep in mind as we get into the nuts and bolts of what the law says, are these particular stories and how you can see where the law applies exactly to these particular fact patterns. And I also want to put out there that both Gloria and Tara are fictional, although we have at the Institute taken sort of nuggets of true stories. So there's a ring of truth to both of their stories, although both Gloria and Tara are fictional. So I want to introduce you all to Gloria, who is a survivor, and she's 35. She's a single mother, which is not uncommon. She has 2 young kids, and she works at a child care program. She lives with her kids in a townhouse that she rents in Philadelphia on the eastern side of the state. The children's father is incarcerated, and Gloria doesn't have any, solid family connections. Her mother has passed away. She never knew her father. And she's been single for several years, and she feels lonely and lost until she meets Sean. And this is sort of the grooming process. Sean begins to exploit the vulnerabilities that he sees immediately in Gloria, that she's lonely, that she doesn't feel attractive, and that she's overwhelmed with working and being the mother of 2 young kids. And so they meet. He's in the middle of divorce, or so he tells her that he is. He begins to shower both her and her children with gifts. They spend a lot of time. They begin an intimate relationship. All the while, he's telling her how much he loves her and wants to have a family with her. And Gloria agrees to allow Sean to move in with him after she becomes pregnant. So again, with this news, she thinks that Sean is going to be thrilled, and initially he is very much. But when she's placed on bed rest, and again, there's 2 small kids in the house, he starts to not come home. He's irritated, he's angry all the time, and he begins to express that anger through physical violence. After the baby's born, Gloria is really upset, wants him to be around more, starts to question him on where he goes. He reacts incredibly violently, chokes her, puts her up against a wall, and threatens her by saying, your curiosity is going to lead to trouble. But eventually, he decides to ask Gloria to join him when he goes out at night, and that's when she learns that he's pimping out other women and has them all in a bunch of different hotels. And he tells her that she now is going to work for him and that she's going to be his queen bee. She's incredibly jealous. She is convinced that this is only going to be temporary. They're going to, eventually have all of their, dream things in the dream home. He's, in effect, selling her this dream. She doesn't want to prostitute. She reluctantly agrees. And she witnesses him becoming more and more violent with the other women that he's also prostituting. He doesn't hit her in front of the other women, but he does in private. She encounters one night a violent sex buyer, and rather than protecting her, Sean brutally beats her and then allows the sex buyer to rape her. She is, out all night, in quotes, working, and she is ultimately fired from her childcare job and has no other means for income. So that is Gloria. And then moving on to introducing all of you to Tara. Tara's situation is slightly different. She had a terrible childhood. Her parents were part of an underground motorcycle gang, and there's a typo here. It's not LCD. I don't know why. It's actually LSD. She was exposed to drugs when she was very small, 2 years old. She began drinking as an early teen, experimenting with other more hard drugs as she got a little bit older. She ended up dropping out of school and running away from home when she was 14, and we all know that if you're 14 and a runaway, you can't sign a lease, you can't get a job, you can't rent a hotel room. And she starts off working in strip clubs and then ultimately ends up inside of a brothel. She has a regular customer named Don. He's a former military officer, and again, he's a regular, so he talks a lot to her. Initially, he's very sweet. She knows he has a violent streak, and he ultimately convinces her that he loves her. And he's incredibly violent with her, choking her on occasion. But he convinces her that he's in love with her, and asks her to marry him. And she's excited. She's had no solid family connections, and she wants to escape his life, so she agreed. At first, things start off great, and she is thrilled to be out of the life of prostitution. She begins to heal, but this is something that Dawn, again, a former sex buyer, holds over her head and tells her that if she doesn't begin to prostitute for him and exposes her initially to some of his buddies, that he's going to drive her back to the brothel and leave her there, and she's terrified. This continues on for years, and eventually she has a child who Dawn refuses to acknowledge, and the child sees this violence around him all of the time and eventually tells a teacher, and that teacher confronts Tara and says that she's either got to leave Dawn or she's going to call child welfare on her, and unfortunately Tara loses custody of her child. So now you for you guys to keep in mind, you know, some of these facts as we work through the law. Specifically when we get into the means that constitute force, fraud, and coercion, both under the federal law and the state law. So just a bit of background here on the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. The federal statute was initially enacted in the year 2000 and has been reauthorized on 4 separate occasions in 2003, 5, 8, and 13, and I believe that they are about, again, to reintroduce some additions to add into the TVPA for reauthorization purposes. Just keep in mind that there are 2 definitions in the TVPA, involuntary servitude and a commercial sex act. Both of these constitute what is human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, and a commercial sex act is any sex act on account of which anything of value at all is given to or received by a person. So keep in mind that anything of value constitutes clothing, food, shelter. It does not have to be in any way, shape, or form money, although it could in fact be money. So the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act was enacted in 2015. It was actually signed into law by President Obama in May of 2015. This law amended and improved the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and created a fund to support services to our domestic trafficking victims. It mandated additional training and it updated definitions of forms of child abuse to include human trafficking and child pornography. Here we have the Federal Crimes Code. It's Section 1591 in the Federal Crimes Code, and the title of it is Sex Trafficking of Minors or by Force, Fraud, and Coercion. And keep in mind, for those of you on the phone who are investigating these cases, you need to look for 3 elements of a crime. you need an act, a means, and for a purpose. And right here in A is where you find your acts, right? So it's an affecting interstate or foreign commerce, or within the special maritime and territorial jurisdiction of the United States. We have our acts that traffickers take: recruiting, enticing, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, advertising, maintaining, patronizing, or soliciting by any means or person, or entities that benefit financially or receive anything of value from helping participating in those acts, right? So just to give you a quick example, if we take the act of harboring, those entities that may financially be benefiting from harboring are hotels. So also keep in mind here that it is only for adults that those means of force, fraud, and coercion are necessary. And you can see that. In reckless disregard of the fact that the means of force, threats of force, fraud, and coercion, which are also defined in the law, or any combination of such means, will be used to cause the person to engage in a commercial sex act, or that the person has not attained the age of 18. So keep in mind that the means of force, fraud, and coercion are not an element of the crime that need to be investigated and ultimately found beyond a reasonable doubt for prosecutorial purposes if the victim is a child. Now, in our fact patterns, both Gloria, who's in her 30s, and Tara, who is in her 20s, are adults. So those means of force, fraud, and coercion are elements of the crime that must be investigated and ultimately proven to a fact finder for purposes of guilt of a trafficker. So again, this just spells it out really easily here. It's you need your acts by the means, and again, those means do not come into play if the victim is a child, for the purpose of a commercial sex act. Now, I have not gone back into this particular slide, and I'm just going to jump back for 1 second to include the acts. Maybe I did. Patronizes is not there. Advertises is. But that's what the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act amendment did in this particular amendment to the TVPA. They added in the language, the acts specifically, patronizes, solicits, and advertises. So I just want to talk for a couple of seconds about what these acts are and what they might be seen by investigators or even victim advocates when you're getting the facts of a particular client or victim or survivor's story. So what does harbors mean? Harbors is the hotel industry. It occurs along with the co-occurring crimes of kidnapping and false imprisonment. And transports, I just threw in a case there for those of you providing legal services, the United States v. Brooks case, and I am very heavy on research pertaining to the federal law because to date, Pennsylvania, because our law is so brand new, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, does not have any case law to date. I know of one case out of Lehigh County that is up on appeal to the Superior Court after conviction, but we do not to date have any case law. So I've been looking to federal law to sort of guide us when we look at our Pennsylvania law. But the Brooks case talks about what transport is, and the defendant was convicted, and that conviction was upheld using that act of transports because he was transporting minors to engage in commercial sex, and he drove the minors to the bus station, purchased their tickets, and then rented a car to drive them out to be prostituted. The act of maintain also is limiting access to transportation or communication with the outside world. So if a trafficker, for instance, in Gloria's case, we know he was keeping other women in hotels and then ultimately Gloria as well. He was maintaining them in those hotels in addition to harboring them in hotels. So he may or may not have let them come and go. And also maintaining is providing access to controlled substances. If a trafficker, in that case Sean, were providing the women with drugs and then leaving the premises specifically, heroin and the opioid crisis, and not coming back for several days, and the girls had no way of, or excuse me, the women had no way of getting heroin. They would go into dope sickness, and it's just an additional way of maintaining them and keeping them compliant. So again, the JVTA was very clear an act of Congress, because they recognized after this case, the Youngers case came down in the 8th Circuit, that those acts also pertain to sex buyers. And in that case of Youngers, obtain was decided to be broad enough to apply both to pimps and purchasers of sex, or we refer to them as Johns, or the demand. And I'm very clear in the language that we use in the Institute. We refer to sex buyers as sex buyers. That's what they are. They are sex buyers. And so there's a small little fact pattern that the Youngers Court explained, and it was just considering a situation where a sex buyer obtains a child from her pimp and decides to take her to Vegas for the weekend. He pays $1,000 for her for the weekend and for one sex act. And he gets in a car, drives to the airport, puts the child on a plane with him, gets to Vegas, drives from the airport to the hotel where he keeps her all weekend. He gets her to agree to additional money in exchange for more sex, and at the end of the weekend puts her on a plane with him, and they come back to wherever they were from. So in that particular fact pattern, we see that the court is saying very clearly that that particular sex buyer would be obtaining the child from her pimp, transporting her to the airport, transporting her by air to Vegas, harboring her in the hotel room, maintaining her in the hotel room, and enticing her with additional money for additional sex acts. So the JVTA amended the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and then ultimately the Federal Crimes Code because they wanted to make it unequivocally clear that in certain situations, the demand or sex buyers should be investigated and prosecuted as traffickers. And I always encourage both law enforcement and prosecutors to exercise that discretion in cases where they deem that sex buyers should be charged as traffickers, if appropriate. And that includes cases involving the high-frequency buyers and definitely in cases involving sex buyers who are buying children for sex. And so we have the means of force, fraud, and coercion. So again, this is not an element of the crime if the victim is a minor, but in GLORIA and Tara's case, it is an element of the crime. And just keep in mind again that the federal courts in the Bell case, again, the 8th Circuit, determined that boyfriend-type behavior constitutes fraud. I call it that selling the dream. And we can see that in both the fact patterns involving Tara and Don, and also with Gloria and Sean, that boyfriend-type behavior absolutely would constitute fraud. And the purpose, again, is for a commercial sex act. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of Pennsylvania's law. And, our law, for all intents and purposes, is a baby law. It's brand new. The TVPA has been around for 17 years now, and our law has only been in effect since September of 2014. And that's important for you guys to keep in mind because we know to date that under Act 105, which is what we call our comprehensive human trafficking statute, there have been only 11 cases that have gone all the way from arrest to prosecution to conviction in the entire Commonwealth. And I can refer you guys to the report that we just published last month on what commercial sex like looks in Pennsylvania to get into the specifics of what counties those prosecutions happened in. But again, it's only 11, and we're coming up on 3 years for this law having been on the books now. So the goal of this comprehensive statute was to provide a comprehensive focus on 3 goals: prosecuting human trafficking cases, and I'm going to walk through the criminal code section in a moment with all of you, preventing human trafficking from happening in the first place, and then protections for our victims and survivors. And I just want to flag up for you guys that 3 very specific protections that we have for our victims and survivors. The first is vacating convictions of survivors that shouldn't have those convictions in the first place because they were trafficking victims, including the crime of prostitution. And that's in Section 3019 of the law. We have a very robust civil remedy. In fact, I think that we have the best civil remedy, state civil remedy in the entire U.S., and that's in Section 3051. And if you all are interested in these, civil lawsuits, we have at least one that I'm aware of out in Philadelphia County where an attorney with client inspector has sued on behalf of child sex trafficking victims, a hotel, under using a civil remedy, which is in Section 3051. And I also want all of you who are providing advocacy services to know that we have a confidentiality protection, and that's in 5945.3. And I'm happy to provide you guys with any resources and references and walk through those specific sections if they're interested. I've also flagged up that you guys, Lehigh County has that first conviction, and that happened in February of 2016. Rob Schoaf, who's a deputy DA in Lehigh County, spent a lot of time building this particular case and ultimately won the first two convictions in the Commonwealth, but I do know that one of them is up on appeal right now, so hopefully we'll have some case law that's specific to Pennsylvania shortly. So our definition of sex trafficking is sexual servitude, and you'll find that in Section 3001. And the definition here, and just keep this in mind, you guys, you have to look at your definition because that's where we know we're directly in line with the federal government, okay, where you see here that it's any sex act or performance involving a sex act for which anything of value is directly or indirectly given, promised to, or received by anyone, or which is performed or provided by an individual and is induced or obtained from a minor, that's key, you guys, a minor, or any of the means set forth in 3012B. And I'm going to get to that in just a second. But our law doesn't say, like the federal law does, the means of force, fraud, and coercion. It says the means in 3012B, and there are 13 factors. But it's right here in this definition that we know those 3012B elements, those means, that is not an element of the crime at all if the victim is a minor. So here we have trafficking in individuals. And this is where you guys are going to find your acts. So again, it's recruiting, enticing, soliciting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, or maintaining. So I've asked for the legislature to provide an amendment to bring us back in line with the federal government's acts because we need to add in advertises and patronizes. And from September of 2014 until the TVPA was signed into law in 2015, there for a hot second we had a more robust law with additional acts because we had solicits and the federal government did not. But now we need to add in two more. So using GLORIA and Tara's fact patterns, you guys can see where they were both recruited by their traffickers, enticed, solicited. I mean, Don started off, you guys, as a sex buyer, and that's how he ultimately convinced Tara to move in with him and marry him. They were both harbored either in hotels or at home. We can only assume that at least in Gloria's case that Sean was transporting her to and from the hotel, providing for them, obtaining, and then again maintaining, which I've already talked through. I've also encouraged investigators to look into subsection 2 here, which is knowingly benefiting financially or receiving anything of value from any of those acts. So looking at the hotel industry or even taxis, which transport, looking at them through the criminal lens and not just the civil lens, right? Because we know that there are certain hotels in every jurisdiction throughout the Commonwealth that are absolutely engaged in knowingly benefiting financially from, helping out traffickers, right? So here we have 3011B, which is trafficking in minors, and it's all of those same acts that pertain to adults, but the grading of the offense for trafficking minors, sex trafficking minors, is a felony of the first degree, and if convicted of 3011B, those particular defendants must register as sex offenders. Now, I'm just going to quickly walk through the means because these are really important. And again, Pennsylvania's legislature did not say the means of force, fraud, and coercion. Instead, they said the means set forth in 3012B, and we have 13 factors. So what I think we can do with those 13 factors is put them into those different categories of force, fraud, and coercion. So I've taken the first three because I think these are pretty clearly force. But force is causing or threatening to cause serious harm to any individuals. We know that in both GLORIA and Tara's cases, force in at least number one was used, physically restraining or threatening to physically restrain another individual, or kidnapping or attempting to kidnap any individual. And again, at a minimum with 1 and 2, you might have corroborating physical injuries that you can get evidence from a hospital or from a physician or a clinic, photographs that detectives can take to preserve, that physical corroborating evidence in these cases. So I've taken them out of order just to go in the order of force, fraud, and coercion, and I kind of lied to you a little bit because the legislature did say fraud. They said fraud, just number 8. No definitions, no explanations, just fraud. But if we again look to the federal case law, and at least Bell, we know that boyfriend-type behavior does constitute fraud. And in both Gloria and Tyra's cases, we've got fraud, right? They were both able to convince Gloria and Tyra that they were in love with them, they wanted a family with them, the white picket fence, you're only going to have to do this for a little bit of time, et cetera, et cetera. So that's good. It does constitute fraud. Now, the psychological manipulation that is coercion is where these cases get a little bit more difficult. And I think that coercion starts off, we can categorize the next several sections in 3012B as coercion. It's abusing or threatening to abuse the legal process. And again, Tara's fact pattern flags up for all of us as professionals where we need to be really careful not to engage in coercive, albeit with good intentions type behavior. But that teacher did say, if you don't leave Dawn, I'm going to call DHS, and she ultimately lost custody of her son. She wanted that little boy and his mom, Tara, not to be in a domestic violence or violent at all type of a situation. But abusing or threatening to abuse the legal process is something that we know traffickers do, right? And we need to be really careful and mindful that with all good intentions of wanting victims and survivors to be safe and to heal, that we don't parallel that behavior. I call it the parallel process. So just keep that in mind. Number 5 is taking or retaining an individual's personal or real property as a means of coercion. I've seen this happen in cases where a trafficker will give, and that's in quotes, a bank account and some money to the women he's prostituting, and then periodically him or other family members will come in and clean out that bank account. They have no legal remedies to recovering that money because they were joint bank accounts. Number 6 is engaging in unlawful conduct with respect to documents. Now, keep in mind, you guys, this does not apply only to documents of foreign nationals. It also applies to any state identification document. So looking at Gloria's case, right, we know that Sean was keeping other women in hotels. I can assure you that he was not renting those hotel rooms in his own name, that he was renting them in the other women's names, and as collateral per se, he was holding on to their driver's licenses. He doesn't want to create a paper trail from these hotels to himself. He's going to put the names of those rooms in his victims and hold on to their IDs. Extortion does happen. That's threatening to send out naked photographs, things like that. If you don't do this to me, I'll call your family. I'll call the police on you. And don't forget, prostitution is a crime in Pennsylvania. And traffickers use that language, and they say, well, you're just a prostitute. No one's going to believe you. And they really buy into that. So it's also defined in Section 2906, and I'll get to that in a minute because that's a bit long. Coercion is also duress through the use of or threat to use unlawful force against a person. So let's pretend like in Tara's case that Don was threatening to hurt the child, right? That would definitely be duress. Death coercion I've seen in prostitution cases where it pertains particularly to foreign national cases where an undocumented woman would be arrested and charged with prostitution and cash bail set at really high amounts. So the trafficker will pay the bail, hire her criminal defense attorney, and all of that money just gets added to her debt. My favorite one is the fact that the legislature recognized number 12. It's facilitating or controlling an individual's access to a controlled substance. And specifically with this heroin epidemic we've got going, we know that traffickers are deliberately keeping their victims addicted to heroin, taking it away from them, causing them to go into dope sickness, and then only giving them enough if they comply. And that's incredibly traumatizing and physically just horrific for these victims. Keep in mind that when traffickers are doing this, that there are people out there, because trafficking exists because people are buying sex. That's why pimps make money, because there's a demand for sex. So keep in mind that there are sex buyers out there deliberately having sex with dope-sick girls in hotel rooms and dope-sick women in hotel rooms. And I can't really wrap my mind around how that happens, but we know that it does. And then finally, using any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause the victim to believe that if the victim doesn't perform the Labor Services Act, or performances in this case, commercial sex acts, they or someone else, like a family member, is going to suffer serious harm or physical restraint. And again, I've spelled out coercion right here in the crimes code. It's already in there, but it already has very specific elements of what we've already talked through. So I'm going to ask Rachel to jump in here with me as we start to talk about these intersections of trafficker or batterer, where we can see the parallels between domestic violence and trafficking. And in these two cases, specifically with terror, family members, we saw, perhaps her parents were first exposing this. We know that they were members of some kind of underground motorcycle gang, and that this is somehow trafficking is specifically tied to, criminal organizations. But we've got distant relatives, parents or neighbors, and then we've got that intimate partner violence, right? I mean, we've got boyfriends. In this case, Don started off as a boyfriend, as did Sean, husband and former partner.
And Jay, what I think is so interesting, and I'm sure, advocates in the audience who work with victims all the time probably find that a victim of domestic violence doesn't realize she's also a victim of human trafficking, and vice versa.
Absolutely.
Because depending on what angle, well, no, he wouldn't do that to me. That's just my boyfriend. And of course he wanted me to have sex with other people, but, that was his thing. And so I think it's very difficult to parse out what really is going on.
And I think you're right. I remember when I was still at the Philadelphia DA's office, this is going back several years now, and before we had Act 105, I got a call over a weekend from just a regular line detective working in Center City and saying, I was involved with the Project Encore and prostitution, and he had these questions, and we had a really unrobust, if that's a word, law previously, and he encountered a domestic violence situation at the hospital where we ultimately found out that the trafficker had broken her ribs and punched her in her face because she refused to go to work. And the detective, in doing a little bit more digging, figured out that work was in fact prostituting. She was also drug addicted. The case ultimately fell apart for various reasons, but I will never forget that, right? It presented initially to detectives, and had we had Act 105, I really think that we would have been able to go after that particular guy for, specifically trafficking, because we now have serious elements of a crime. But I'll never forget that case. He beat her up because she refused to go to work, and he was her boyfriend, and she was being forced to prostitute for him. So absolutely. So, let's look here at the continuum of abuse. And you guys are already familiar with the power and control wheel.
And, again, for particularly people that work with victims, you've seen this. You know what it looks like, and the wheel. And it talks a lot about intimidation, economic abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, all the things that we know happen to victims of domestic violence. And we're pulling it up so it's just a little bit bigger. One of the big ones that we all know is using children to, try to control the victim, that if you leave me, then I will take the kids. And, those are very common, but at the core of the power and control wheel is power and control. So when you're talking about domestic violence, it's all about getting that power and control all these different ways. It can involve economic abuse, it can involve sex abuse, it can involve kids. But what's so interesting, I think we're going to, there we go. So we have, the domestic violence power and control wheel. What's so fascinating to me, Shea, is when you look at the sex trafficking power and control wheel, it's the same. It's like identical. It's all the behaviors, the coercion, the intimidation, the emotional abuse, the isolation, physical, using privilege, economic, sexual. Now, they don't list kids on here, but in the scenarios you gave, Shea, the kids were a factor. It's all the same. And so it's all about the power and control, and it's all the same behaviors that human trafficking victims, who may or may not also be a victim of domestic violence, are experiencing, because that's how traffickers get them to work for them.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. The similarities are striking. You know, there are layers and layers of this that are just on top of one another, but incredibly striking. And again, like you said, power and control is at the center of all of this. So let's just look here at the physical and sexual violence and break it down a little bit. So we know that rape is a means to power and control, and it can be done by the exploiter or indirect by the sex buyer. And in that, particular scenario with Tara and Don, he was bringing over his buddies and allowing them to rape her. And in Gloria's case, Sean allowed that sex buyer to rape her after he just beat the, tar out of her. So what goes along with this is the self-medication, right? The disassociation and the drug abuse. And beatings and sexual assault physically and psychologically demobilize victims. You've got starvation. I mean, do you think that traffickers are going to take the time out of their day to feed the women and girls, or men and boys in their stables? I don't think so. They might let them have McDonald's once a week. And we also know that forced abortions or beatings that are intended to result in terminated pregnancies happen. And we know in cases of domestic violence that happens as well. And I've already really walked through with you guys how facilitating or controlling access to drugs is just key in all of this. And when I'm teaching law enforcement and I get into the nuance of prostitution and ask, if I say that word, what are some things that come to mind? Drug abuse goes hand in hand. We've all heard, crack hoe, for crying out loud. And again, rhetoric and words mean everything, but I have to tell you, if I were being forced to engage in commercial sex all day, I would do drugs too. So here we have coercion and threat. And I think Rachel already talked about this a little bit, right? Threatening to take away kids. Happens.
Yeah, and it's strikingly similar. Threatening to expose sexual history, threatening legal consequences, physical dominion, threatening to hurt the victim, threatening to not give them money. This is all stuff that happens to victims of domestic violence all the time. And it's the same with the sex abuse, because when you're working with a victim of domestic violence, at least in my experience, if you ask them, has your boyfriend ever raped you? No, he never raped me. Okay, so when you ask the question a little differently, well, did he ever make you have sex when you didn't want to? Well, yeah. Well, that's rape. But again, they don't see it that way. So again, it's all these similarities.
Absolutely. So emotional and psychological abuse are, again, that's the coercion, right? So we know romance. We saw that both with Don and with Sean, right? They're the Romeo pimps, selling the dream, promises of true love, lavish gift-giving. Sean even gave gifts to Gloria's kids to, ingratiate himself and be part of this family. Intimidation. Obedience is everything. Brutally beating others as punishment in front of others is really important. And, I've seen cases where you have survivors who were being punished for not making enough money, but rather than them being the ones enduring the beating, they're forced to watch the trafficker beat another girl, or they are ordered to beat another girl. And it's just that pins and needles and never knowing when that other shoe is going to drop. That is just, again, that psychological torture is the only way I can describe it. Humiliation. We saw that with Don and Tara, constantly holding over her head. I don't like to use that word rescue. It has a lot of connotations that go with it, but he got her out of the brothel and then consistently held that over her head. Isolating. We know in domestic violence that's what the perpetrators of DV do. They isolate them. Same with trafficking. It's that constantly, where are you going? Who are you with? What are you up to? Using guilt, exploiting family values. And there is a whole prostitution lingo or dictionary out there that gets into the daddy and the wife-in-laws and what does the jargon mean, and it's on genderberg.org, and if you Google prostitution dictionary, it'll pop up, but it talks about the game and the rules and what all of these different things mean. Economic abuse. We know in domestic violence, economic abuse is huge, and it's a huge barrier for a lot of women to walk away.
Yeah, it's enormous, and again, we all know that for a lot of our victims, that's one of the main reasons why they can't leave. They don't have money, they can't afford it, they can't support their kids. And again, human trafficking is all about the trafficker getting rich and the victim having nothing.
They're a means to an end, and it's just horrific. And, you know, in Gloria's case, that other little job she had at the daycare, she ultimately lost. Because, I mean, could you imagine having to work, and again, that's in quotes, you guys can't see me making the air quotes, but work, because I don't believe it's work in any way, shape, or form. And she was up all night and loses her job and has no way of providing for the two kids and the other new baby that just came, right? It's horrifying. Using privilege and exploiting vulnerability. And this is key. When people ask me, you know, who's at risk of becoming a trafficking victim? Who's at risk of that? The answer is very simple and very complex all at the same time. Anyone, boys or girls, men and women, anyone with a vulnerability can be exploited. And traffickers they specifically target girls and women with those vulnerabilities. It could be lack of father figures, low self-esteem, like we saw in both Gloria and Tara's cases, and someone with mental health issues. We know they prey on those vulnerabilities. We know that traffickers themselves are insecure and narcissists. And we know that the traffickers define the roles and expectations. You know, there are books out there on Amazon, and I cannot bring myself to buy them, but that are written by pimps on how to pimp. And they know that, you know, and having a bottom girl, someone who's in control of the stable, their power and control mechanisms. I mean, there are pimps out there that say every pimp needs to have a bottom, and it's that one girl or woman who recruits may take a cut of the profits. And, you know, we saw in Sean's case, he told Gloria he was going to make her the queen bee. There are consequences that come along with that, and I would encourage investigators and law enforcement to look at bottom girls as victims because they're still prostituting. You know, what would the consequences be if they don't also follow the rules of whatever the pimp's game is? You know, so it's frightening to me that traffickers are also making money by selling books they write on Amazon.com. And now we have, like, the indicators in the industry. So excess of control or monitoring by companions, that financial dependence, the physical injuries that can be documented either in medical records or by photographs, burns, bruises, and other physical injuries, canned or practiced cover-up stories, isolation, inappropriate clothing to the age for the season. There's confusion about timelines and whereabouts, and we know that there's been, you know, some really good research into brain science involving trauma victims and how memories do not come from a start to finish sort of linear fashion, and they come out scattered, and that's because of the trauma, and that causes, you know, a brain injury. And also pornography and massage parlors, brothel, strip clubs. Seriously, in Don and Tara's case, he met her in a strip club. He was a sex buyer. He befriended her. He took her, you know, out of that brothel. It's a gateway.
Yeah, and Shay, as you're going through the list, like, it shouldn't surprise me, but as I'm listening to you talk about this is all DV. These are all things that happen in a DV relationship where there's not human trafficking, but when the perpetrator of domestic violence is basically grooming their victim and getting control over their victim, and these are all things they do. Absolutely. The parallels are significant. So victim services. You know, complex needs require specialized trauma-informed services, and trauma-informed are buzzwords, right? Like, a lot of people in grant applications are using trauma-informed, but what does it mean? What does it really mean? You know, how do you take that trauma-informed training and apply it to your daily work?
How do investigators engage in trauma-informed interview techniques, right? It's being patient. It's meeting them where they at in their continuum of healing. And services include safe, stable housing, therapy, healthcare, education, substance abuse treatment, legal services, case management, and economic empowerment assistance. Again, legal services, specific remedies under Act 105 are available, right, to sex trafficking victims, vacator, expungement, suing traffickers. These are really important to remember. And trauma is the biggest barrier to recovery. And Rachel, wouldn't you say that's the same thing in domestic violence?
I think so. I think that's obviously a huge factor for anyone who's been victimized, especially when you've been victimized by someone you loved.
Right. And, something that, one of the victim service providers that I work with always says, it's like they're so thankful for the smallest little kindnesses, even candy bars, right? That someone is taking the time to, get me a candy bar, so they're not worthy. But it's that denial of victimization and part of that whole trauma bonding. And, kids especially, they'll adapt. They'll make a horrific situation because they just want to survive their new normal. And so undoing all of that it takes a lot of patience. It's important for investigators and victim services to work in tandem, to be on the same page, because everyone really wants the same goal. This quote here is just so horrifying to me. But to our knowledge, no population of women's studies previously has had such a crude mortality rate, standardized mortality ratio, or percentage of deaths due to murder, even approximating prostituted persons. And I know the same thing happens in domestic violence. And, death, unfortunately, is a reality in these particular cases, either through being murdered or drug abuse. Safety planning is crucial. I know that safety planning in domestic violence is
Yep, it's number one.
Number one.
It's number one. Because, again, there are victims of domestic violence who can't leave, don't want to leave, aren't ready to leave, but, you